years since I've been in the Maritimes. First came because of my relationship as a national officer with the United Church of Canada, which is really what took me from the pastorate and started me traveling and consulting, beginning in Canada from Newfoundland to Victoria and everywhere in between, and then more broadly. And today I travel about 200 days a year, working primarily with churches across North America, Australia, and New Zealand. We work with churches across the theological spectrum, from very, very fundamentalist conservative churches to very, very liberal churches. And we work across the denominational spectrum from evangelical to mainstream to independent and to the emerging church movement. I have had a lot of experience working with all kinds of churches, big churches, mega churches, small churches, micro churches, house churches, African American churches, African churches, Asian churches. And I go into some length talking about that, hoping that something in that experience will connect with you and with your context. My hope is to engage you in some private conversations over the next 3 days. This particular format doesn't allow us to go very far in understanding your particular ministry context or your particular mission challenges. So I hope that in conversation I can get to understand you a little bit better. May I just ask for a show of hands before we begin, just to kind of get an idea of who all is here. How many of you are clergy in the room? Oh my, okay. And how many then are volunteers, laity in the room? And how many of you are Baptists in the room? And how many of you are other in the room? Okay. And I'll learn who you all are as we talk further together. One other question, please. How many of you are in congregations that worship fewer than 50 on a given Sunday? And how many of you are in congregations that worship between 50 and 100? Okay. And how many of you are in congregations that worship over 100? Over 200? Over 300? Over 400? Over 500? Terry, we'll see how long you keep your hand up. Go, keep going. And I think Terry's mathematics are different than some of ours, so that's okay. No, I appreciated talking with you, Terry, over dinner. That gives me a little bit of an idea of who you are, but only the very beginning. So today, I would like to introduce you to what I call the synergy of church growth. And I'm going to be fairly conservative as I do this and do it in kind of a traditional lecture format. Tomorrow we'll work more with our PowerPoint and be more dialogical over the next 2 times. I have given up anticipating which parts of my presentation are boring and which parts are stressful. And I expect, and I want you to tell me during the break, I assure you that I can be a good deal more stressful than I'm going to be in the next 3 evenings. My wife tells me I can also be a good deal more boring, if you would prefer. But I want to introduce you to the synergy of authentic church growth as I have come to see it among growing churches all over North America, Australia, and New Zealand today, and give you some sense of why and how churches grow, and then some sense of how you can grow and anticipate church growth. Tomorrow evening, I would like then to take a step back and look at the big picture of different kinds of churches at different stages of growth across North America, and try to give you some insight into the most significant leverage points or strategic or transitionary moves that you can make as congregational leaders, whether you're clergy or lay, to grow your church into God's mission in the future. And we'll talk more about the stresses and the challenges, the obstacles and the opportunities that you will face. And then finally, on the third lecture, I would like to share with you some insights around spiritual leadership and talk further about the growing crisis in North America and across the Western world, the growing crisis around the credibility of clergy in particular, and the challenge that we face to rediscover, reinvent, and redeploy ourselves as credible spiritual leaders in the emerging pagan world. That's where I'm going, and I hope most of you will be able to hang in there all 3 days, and I hope that we will have opportunities for conversation, and I hope that you will tell me when I have been boring, and I'll try to move a little faster, and when I have perhaps been too stressful or confusing and I need to slow down. You have a handout this evening which gives you a basic diagram that I'm going to be focusing all evening, and at least highlight some of the key points that I want to make. Authentic church growth can be summarized in just 2 words, and I hope that you will brand these words in your hearts, but more importantly in the hearts of your board, and more importantly in the hearts of your ushers, and more importantly in the hearts of your choir. Deeper, further. Deeper, further. Church growth in the historical perspective of the great reformations and missional movements from the earliest church is all about going deeper and deeper and deeper into the mystery of Jesus the Christ, and going further and further and further with Christ on the road to mission. The artificial separation of the Great Commandment and the Great Commission, perpetuated by modern North American denominations in the 20th century, is simply unfaithful in the eyes of our Christian ancestors. Modern Christendom has been defined more by its dogged pursuit of theological and institutional sidetracks than its faithful persistence in an explicitly Christian spiritual life. This is radically and perhaps apocalyptically changing in the emerging post-secular world. What is authentic church growth is the ability of highly committed disciples to shape and share the fathomless, non-rational experience of Jesus Christ. It has never been about conversions, memberships, budgets, or egos. It has always been about multiplying disciples who multiply disciples who change the world one microculture at a time in the direction of God's purpose. Established churches of every brand name are fast losing credibility today because they continually want to sidetrack the seeker into worrying about church properties, religious programs, certified personnel, and ecclesiastical polity. And I predict that what I call the 4 Ps of the 20th century will one day rank with the 7 deadly sins of the 4th century. Authentic churches are growing precisely because they refocus the church back to spiritual companionship, lifestyle discipline, credible mentoring, and missional purpose. We are already discovering that in the bubbling cauldron of spirituality that is the post-secular world, and in which the established Christian church is now small potatoes, that any church really committed to going deeper and further in Christ through spiritual companionship, lifestyle disciplines, credible mentoring, and missional purpose will grow numerically. Indeed, it will mirror the demographic diversity of the postal codes. Numerical growth is not an assurance of authenticity, but if you do not see it, the reason is more likely the unfaithfulness of the church than the indifference of society. At the heart of authentic church growth is a discipling process, like that on the screen. Churches do not grow simply because they have adequate parking, great music, charismatic preachers, or agreeable public policies. They grow because they have a system to transform, mature, and fulfill lives. If you look at that diagram, you will see the synergy of church growth, which we see repeated over and over again in emerging growing churches all over North America, regardless of brand name, theological position, or ideological perspective. Any stranger to grace can enter that discipling process at any point. The key is that they move in a never-ending cycle from one point to another, and that this movement happens neither by chance nor by programming, but through deliberate intervention and coaching of mentors. The numerical measurement of success has nothing to do with overall worship attendance or membership, but rather in the percentages of people on the move with Christ to go deeper and further. In the fullness of a growing church, fully 60% of the youth and adults in any given worship service will participate later that week in some form of disciplined spiritual growth companionship. This compares to the meager 2 to 7% that is typical in most established churches of all denominational brand names in North America today. In the fullness of a growing church, fully 40% of the people in serious spiritual disciplines will be active personally, hands-on in outreach missions that they have incorporated into their busy lifestyles. These activities will be among non-church members anywhere in the postal code or the world, and they will simultaneously do good things and articulate their faith motivation for doing them, thus uniting evangelism and social action as two sides of the same coin. And this compares to the meager 0 to 5% of traditional church members. In the fullness of a growing church, fully 30% of the worshiping congregation will be seekers and other strangers to grace who have been invited and accompanied to worship as a direct result of their encounters and conversations with Christian disciples as they pursued personal mission for which they have been gifted and called. And this compares to a meager 0 to 2% typical of most established churches. Now, most church leaders I speak with are astonished at these percentages and deny that it is even possible to achieve them. They are not unlike the Pharisees, listening to Jesus' stern challenges to let the dead bury their own dead, and his audacious criticisms of the learned, affluent students of the Torah and parliamentary procedure, who ask, "But Lord, who then can be saved?" The secret is in the mentoring. If you refer to the chart, the secret of church growth does not lie in the programs in each of the bases in the diagram, but in the coaching represented by the arrows between them. Dying churches deploy a pastor or a handful of other professional staff to move people along in their spiritual growth. Even if they are committed to mentoring, which most are not, they are too few. Growing churches deploy gifted, called, equipped, and accountable laity or volunteers who are spiritually deep, missionally motivated, eager to talk, and courageous enough to confront Ananias and Sapphira. Listen carefully. I'm going to repeat this sentence a couple of times. Church growth happens when the church is wholly dedicated to leadership development rather than program management. Church growth happens when the church is wholly dedicated to leadership development rather than program management. So let's take a closer look at this synergy of church growth to understand the stages and transitions, and then we'll examine the three major sidetracks that cause the synergy to collapse into institutional churchiness. Life-shaping worship. I've chosen my words with some care. Life-shaping worship is extraordinarily pragmatic and purposeful. It is extraordinarily flexible about tactics, but rigorously aligned to mission. There are no sacred tactics. There is no sacred music. There are no sacred instruments. There are no sacred liturgies. There are no sacred floor plans. There is nothing sacred about how worship is designed. You just do what works. What is sacred is the purpose of worship, the results of worship, or the impact of worship to contribute to God's mission to redeem the world. Two decisive biblical texts define life-shaping worship. First, Micah denounced the supposedly good worship of his time and identifies the really sacred point of it all. Worship, he says, is not about personal abasement, sacrificial offerings, and heritage protection. It is about doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with the Lord. Worship has never had anything to do with praising God, as if God wanted or needed our praise. Worship has always had to do with being godly, motivating faithful people to do the right thing, live the right life, and share the joy with strangers. The best way to praise God. Second, St. Paul dramatically rejects the good worship of the established religion in favor of the relevant life-shaping worship indigenous to the mission field. It happens in Corinth in Acts chapter 18, just after he mentors Priscilla and Aquila into the experience of Christ. He is faced with the intransigent judgment, and he literally removes himself next door to the private home of a Gentile named Titius Justus, bringing along the head of the synagogue, and he starts a wholly different alternative worship service. And faced with unremitting denigration from the traditional membership, God tells him in a dream, "Do not be afraid, but do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one shall attack you to harm you. For I have many people in this city." And immediately, the church swells with spiritually hungry, institutionally alienated strangers to grace, looking for mentors to take them deeper and further. Life-shaping worship is not designed for what people want, either members or non-members, but for what their broken, lost, lonesome, anxious, trapped, or victimized lives need. It is worship shaped by mission purpose rather than aesthetic taste or personal preference. And generally speaking, when we survey the alternatives of worship in North America today, there are 5 basic kinds of worship: transformational, educational, inspirational, caregiving, and mission connectional. No single worship service can address more than 2 of these things at any time, which is why so-called blended worship rarely works long for church growth. Traditional established churches are pretty good at providing educational and caregiving worship, except they often educate people about things that fundamentally do not matter, and comfort people who, quite frankly, ought to be a heaven of a lot more stressed out. Transformational worship is rare because modern Christians, at least in North America, generally do not believe in the possibility of radical evil, or if they do, they are skeptical about even more radical grace. If God actually shows up for worship, it scares the daylights out of them. Worship rarely commissions, celebrates, and prays for the actual hands-on missions around which members have personally staked their financial stability and vacation plans. And worship may inspire, But to what end? Coffee hour? Life-shaping worship changes all that. The way to measure the success of life-shaping worship is to count how many significant conversations happen between mentors and seekers on any given Sunday morning. What is a significant conversation, you ask? It is a spontaneous conversation motivated before, during, and after worship about God's activity, my participation in it, spiritual yearning of the public, and the next steps of the gospel. As a rule of thumb, a growing church will experience at least 5 significant conversations for every one elder, board member, choir member, and band member, usher, and staff person, including the secretary and the custodian. 5 significant conversations per Sunday between a seeker and a mentor for each one of those people. You add it up. You do the math. If it is a significant conversation, it will be memorable. Gather the leaders of your church Sunday afternoon after worship and simply count. Life-shaping worship draws people, compels people into midweek small groups, post-worship spiritual disciplines, and other accountable spiritual growth opportunities where 2 or 3 adults are gathered together. And this transition is not random. It is guided by mentors deployed by the congregation before, during, and after worship, precisely to intervene and guide people on their way. So let's talk about spiritual disciplines. The second stage of the discipling process is about continuous, accountable spiritual discipline. This means that it's regularly performed, usually in company with a small group of like-hearted individuals who can encourage, challenge, listen, and learn from each other. The tactics vary, but a spiritual discipline generally includes daily Bible reading, daily intercessory prayer for strangers, weekly participation in a small group or cell group, regular involvement in some outreach mission, and dedicating 90% of your money and time to God's purposes while keeping a tithe, a tenth, for yourself. Today, we readily think of small groups or cell groups as our paradigm for accountable spiritual discipline, but there's so much confusion and obfuscation about what a small group really is that I prefer to talk about pilgrim bands. And you'll hear me talk about pilgrim bands more than once over the next 3 days. Think of Chaucer, or the pilgrims that traveled in groups from the 4th through the 13th centuries to a variety of holy destinations. That's a pilgrim band. They traveled in groups not only for safety, but for edifying conversation that would encourage their spiritual growth. The simple accountability tools of the 7 deadly sins and the 7 lively virtues emerged from the conversations of just such pilgrim bands as they traveled. How entrapped are you by one of the 7 deadly sins, they would ask. How liberated are you to one of the 7 deadly virtues, or 7 lively virtues, they would ask. These same pilgrims deliberately stopped along the way to perform acts of charity in hospices, churches, public works, and schools. They mortgaged their homes, trusted their possessions to friends, burned the sign of the cross into their flesh, and with no more than scrip, stave, sandals, and songs, which, translated into modern parlance, means backpack, laptop, hiking shoes, and rap music, literally follow Jesus the Christ deeper and further. The difference between modern Christian education and pre- and postmodern spiritual discipline is an even more significant revolution than missionally targeting worship. Modern Christian education is a rational endeavor. It assumes, in the best traditions of the Enlightenment, that knowledge is achieved by the individual's perception and organization of data. Most of our Bible studies, especially our higher critical Bible studies, are designed for the subject, me, to grasp the object, God, in as controllable, manageable, and reasonable manner as possible. Spiritual discipline goes back to a more ancient understanding of knowledge as the merging of life in a higher, purer truth. Christians did not study the Bible. They experienced it. The goal is not for me to grasp God, but to put myself in such a precarious, vulnerable, and transparent position that I might be grasped by God. And this intuition that truth is bigger than concept has led to the demise of the Sunday school and the resurgence of the small group as the primary vehicle of spiritual growth today. Sunday school satisfied my curiosity. Small groups satisfy my spiritual yearning. At best, modern Christian education helps people discern their spiritual gifts, just as it helps people understand their personality type, their demographic roots, their time management strategy, and their potential skills. Christian education moves people efficiently into task groups and committees, understanding their duty to the church and ready to implement the ecclesiastical agenda. Pilgrim bands, on the other hand, move people into mission teams, submissive to a Christian lifestyle and ready to stake their lives on a higher purpose. Spiritual discipline is less about discerning spiritual gifts that you never knew you had than it is about receiving spiritual gifts that you never had in the first place. Grasped by God, the individual is transformed through the accountability of the small group. It is this new mix of reasonable conversation plus contemplative waiting, action reflection, intercessory prayer for strangers, and constant mobility that describes the inner working of the Pilgrim Band. Indeed, it is the emerging mix of higher education in general that is no longer about, quote, going to college, but about, quote, making a collage of personal growth experiences. It depends on a peer group, not a standardized curriculum. It is geared to deliver personal fulfillment, not a steady job. And its fruit and driving force is not love for the church, but desire for God. The spiritual discipline of the Pilgrim Band is a good deal scarier than the educational discipline of the Sunday school or the Bible study. It is less appealing, therefore, to hierarchies and bureaucracies. Denominations have as much difficulty controlling small groups as the 4th century Catholic diocese had controlling the monastic movement. Suddenly, you see, mission is no longer dictated from above, from the strategic planning and ideological debates of the experts. Suddenly, mission emerges from below and is elicited by the Holy Spirit from spiritually growing companionships. Now, this is more than prophetic. This is potentially apocalyptic. Nothing else can transform the world like a transformed life. In such an unmanageable learning environment as it is today, mentoring becomes even more crucial. Mentoring is both evocative and provocative. It evokes recognition of hidden resources and surprising opportunities. It provokes self-critical thinking and openness to disturbing realities. Most important of all, mentoring is opportunistic. It demands spiritually mature leaders who can instantly seize emerging opportunities for breakthrough insights, and coaches who can move people into different companionships and experiences to keep the momentum of constant personal growth going. So let's talk about mission action. This third stage in the discipling process is all about doing mission. It is motivated by worship. It is precipitated through spiritual discipline. Mission action in authentic church growth is not an extra tacked on to busy lives. It is intrinsic to the lifestyles of spiritually growing people. It is a natural extension of spiritual life. The exhale of love follows the inhale of spirit. Mission is not a project to accomplish, but a projection, a logical consequence, or a practical fruit of merging with Christ. So first, it's personal and passionate. Since mission emerges from spiritual growth rather than strategic planning, there is extraordinary personal ownership in a growing church. The individual has a personal stake in the successful result, and therefore is unlikely to burn out or be sidetracked from their purpose, and certainly unlike to go to a meeting. And second, mission will be called and accountable. Since mission aligns lifestyle with purpose, there is a greater readiness to risk leaving behind comfort zones to do things contrary to one's nature, the very definition of a call. Submission to the accountability of the Pilgrim Band, now turned mission team, drives individuals beyond their normal limitations and their old standards of excellence. Mission in a growing church is any activity that simultaneously blesses a stranger with life and shares the faith motivation for doing so. It is a unity of social action and evangelism. One does not do good stuff without sharing faith. One does not share faith without doing good stuff. The key word for mission action in authentic church growth is the word alignment. Team mission that emerges from the spiritual discipline of the Pilgrim Band is difficult to sidetrack toward other goals. Personal mission is rigorously, and I might well use the word ruthlessly as I think of Ananias and Sapphira. It is rigorously aligned with three levels of purpose: God's mission to redeem the world, the church's mission to multiply disciples, and the team mission to leverage as much positive change in order to reach that end. Christians in an authentically growing church invest so much and take so many risks that friends and family are bound to ask, why? Why give so much? To create positive change as quickly as possible. Why create change? To multiply disciples. Why is it important to multiply disciples? To redeem the world. The primary responsibility of the Pilgrim Band is to guard this alignment as rigorously and sometimes ruthlessly as possible. Mission action, by its very nature, invites strangers to grace, to the place and people where grace can be experienced. This is yet another form of mentoring. This time, the desire to help seekers experience personal transformation in their own way for their own needs. Of course, it would be a betrayal of the stranger's trust to promise an experience of grace specific to their needs and then fail to deliver it with a worship service designed to do something else. Mission action completes the synergy of authentic church growth by drawing strangers to grace toward a transformational encounter with the divine. At this point, if I were in a very high-tech environment, we'd play some meditative music and think about it for a while. But I invite you to carry on with me, and let's explore the sidetracks to the spiritual life. And if you can, we'll answer questions after we're done, and then during our refreshment time later this evening. But it is vitally important not only to understand the synergy of church growth, but to begin to understand the sidetracks into which the traditional church constantly is tempted, and which is leading to an overall, ever-accelerating decline of church participation all across North America. The description of the synergy of authentic church growth has provided quite an ideal picture. It can be argued that all denominations began with just such synergy, and the story of their decline represents the disintegration of that synergy. The more churches and church leaders replicate the stages and mentoring of this synergy, the more the church grows in the emerging post-secular world. The more churches and church leaders fail to replicate this synergy, the more they decline. It is important to note that in the fast-paced, highly mobile, competitively pagan world of today, that growth or decline can be sudden and precipitate. It used to take years to build and years to decay. But that is true no longer. It can happen overnight. So here's the chart that indicates the three major sidetracks. There are three primary ways churches become sidetracked from the synergy of church growth. Each sidetrack, mind you, is a result of leadership failure rather than program failure. And in this, clergy and lay leaders, boards, choirs, ushers, and anyone in the leadership must take church decline very personally. Sidetracks happen not because the stages of church growth don't work, but because the mentoring in between the stages breaks down. For years, the modern church trained leaders for the stages of church growth, but utterly failed to train leaders to mentor the transitions from one stage to another. The ancient world, the world of the mission to the Gentiles, did it right. They grew leaders who knew how to mentor rather than leaders who knew how to manage. So let's talk about the first sidetrack, the sidetrack of membership privileges. This is the sidetrack that blocks people emerging from life-shaping worship to enter spiritual disciplines. This first sidetrack to authentic church growth is that Christians fail to enter serious partnered spiritual disciplines and become obsessed with membership privileges. They spend all their time trying to shape God's mission to redeem the world around personal tastes, ideological preferences, private life cycles, and personal neediness. The sidetrack is pervasive and insidious, creeping into every aspect of church life. It drives Christians to the great evils of preoccupation with property, program, personnel, and polity. The list of ways church people protect membership privileges is endless. Every debate about sacred music, worship space, renovation, property rental, wedding policy, Sunday school curricula, youth programming, public policy, and staff deployment easily becomes a quarrel between members seeking privileges. The church should serve my food groups after worship, play my kind of music, visit my parents in the hospital, agree with my political perspective, and most especially give my daughter a financial break on her wedding day. Now, there are four primary symptoms of membership privilege. Number one, pastor dependency. Churches sidetracked into membership privilege rely on paid staff to do the whole work of ministry. Job descriptions become unwieldy task lists overseen by redundant levels of bureaucracy, linked to constant reporting and approval. And as the laity grow lazier, the clergy get busier. Left unchecked, dependency becomes codependency, as the so-called happy pastoral relationship becomes defined by needy people sustained by clergy with a need to be needed through all the life cycles until they die. Second sign of membership privilege, demographic indifference. Churches sidetracked into membership privilege are generally unaware of the demographic trends, lifestyle segments, and ever-changing affinity groups in their primary mission field. This mission field is defined today by the average distance people are willing to drive to work and shop. The diversity of that mission field is not mirrored by the inclusiveness of the membership. Left unchecked, indifference becomes prejudice as the church lingers in denial and focuses on the homogeneity of being one happy family. Third sign of membership privilege, standalone worship. Churches sidetracked into membership privilege regard worship as the single Christian faith and fellowship moment in their week. It provides time to socialize with friends and pay dues for services rendered, and powerfully motivates members to attend meetings. Left unchecked, fully 33 to 75% of the members do not even feel it important to participate in worship at any given time. Fourth sign of membership privilege, harmony at all cost. Churches sidetracked into membership privilege confuse irresponsibility with mercy. Hundreds of strangers may fail to connect with the church, but the church will agonize over the possibility that one or two members might leave the church. And left unchecked, the church accepts the most outrageous behavior from members and the most bizarre statements from the pulpit in the name of family. The sidetrack of membership privilege is the fundamental attitude of me first. First, the church pays for their own institutional expenses, and if there is any money left over, they might give it away. First, the clergy visits the members and they're sick, and then if they have any time left over, they mingle with the public. First, the members spend time at work and play, transporting children to amateur sports and looking after their own interests, and then if they have any time left over, they play with spiritual disciplines. And the only way to break the compulsion for membership privilege is spiritual discipline. Precisely what declining churches refuse to do. Now, the real key lies in leadership development and deployment. Staff, including pastors, custodians, and secretaries, and core volunteers, including boards, trustees, and worship leaders, must model the spiritual life and mentor members into intentionally designed affinity groups that hold people accountable for spiritual growth. Leaders vigorously address the four symptoms of membership privilege by focusing the missional urgency of clergy, sensitizing the board to demographic realities, training worship designers to develop indigenous and mission-driven worship, and strategically disharmonizing the church. Let's talk about the sidetrack of committees and task groups. The second sidetrack for authentic church growth is that Christians fail to follow spiritual disciplines into mission action. Spiritual gifts discovery is not taken far enough to include mentoring to discern personal mission. Members satisfy their curiosity, they understand the Bible, they learn their personality types and their gift sets, they learn to love the church, but then they are sidetracked to fill committee vacancies. Their spiritual gifts are co-opted to implement the mission agenda of the institution, rather than focused to fulfill a personal destiny. When personal gifts are used to implement someone else's agenda, burnout is the inevitable result. Committees and task groups are actually designed today to limit the power of individuals or pilgrim bands to discern, design, implement, and evaluate mission. In other words, the mission agenda of the church is controlled by the expertise, certification, or strategic planning of professionals or duly elected officers of the institution. To be sure, this is not how the top of the bureaucracy understands it. They feel that committees and task groups are the working units necessary to get anything done. This is true only in the sense that committees and task groups implement the mission agendas discerned and designed from above and allow people from above the power to evaluate success. The underlying issue here is trust. Trust only comes from constant, disciplined spiritual growth. In the absence of trust, bureaucracy multiplies. Therefore, the symptoms of this sidetrack include the following. Number one, extensive nominations processes. Congregational energy is absorbed by political maneuvering and guilt manipulation. People are begged to serve offices, reluctantly volunteer for limited times, or repeatedly explain why they cannot serve. Holding office and voting privileges become more important than continuous learning or spiritual growth. Second symptom, unified budgets. Congregational energy is deflected into promoting and defending budgets that place institutional infrastructure needs first and mission results second. Leaders become frustrated not to have initiative in raising money directly for team mission. And the third sign is frequent reporting. Leadership energy is diverted to liaisons and meetings, otherwise known as consensus management. It takes the average annual meeting 4 hours of heated debate to change the color of the sign on the front lawn. Members are drawn into redundant layers of meetings as decisions are debated, researched, deferred, and debated all over again. Now, the only way to break the compulsion for committees and task groups is volunteer empowerment. This means that leaders mentor members to understand clear boundaries of core values, bedrock beliefs, vision, and mission, and then equip pilgrim bands to take responsibility to discern mission opportunities, design mission strategies, implement mission tactics, and evaluate mission results. Mission teams can then be trusted to get results, provided they stay within the boundaries, without requiring the supervision of a bureaucracy or the tactical agreement of all the members. And now finally, the third sidetrack. The final sidetrack for authentic church growth is that members do good works, but fail to share their faith motivation for doing them. There is no communication of faith, no sharing of the experience of Christ, no invitation to come and be touched by grace, and therefore no invitation to come to life-shaping worship. Church members emerge from spiritual growth disciplines, perhaps having discerned both gifts and calling, but they spin away from the church to join other nonprofit organizations or social service projects. Worship becomes practically irrelevant to social service. just as the experience of Christ seems to be irrelevant to their good work. I say seems to be because, in fact, a profound thanksgiving for grace and experience of Christ often continues within the heart of the servant. It's just not shared. Why? Why isn't it shared? The most common modern response, which is to say, quote, actions speak louder than words, unquote, is so patently false in the contemporary world that surely something else must be causing church members to short-circuit the discipling process. It is as if 14th century nuns were to die nursing victims of the plague without ever making the sign of the cross. Well, there are 4 reasons. First reason faith is not shared is the fear of offending others. Church members still assume a secular world in which atheists will demand their right to ignore God. And they seem to be unaware that the secular world died. And the world is a highly spiritual world in which seekers are looking for meaning. Second reason they don't share faith, they have a fear of embarrassing themselves. Church members are anxious about the poverty of their own faith, or embarrassed that the worship service they might invite people to attend, in fact, is lifeless rather than life-shaping. Third reason they don't share faith, they have a fear of confronting fresh questions. Church members fear that the intentional juxtaposition of faith and reality might raise questions about life, death, God, meaning, and hope that they cannot answer for themselves or their questioners. And then finally, there's the fear of paying the price of discipleship. Church members fear the financial, relational, legal, or existential repercussions of being publicly identified as Christian. They fear martyrdom and choose to be silent. Once again, the only way to break out of mere philanthropy is to provide mentors who can participate in the action-reflection, risk-failure-learn world of the entrepreneurial missionary. A consciousness-raising program and an activism strategy will not help. Mentors must be readily available to interpret the pagan world and reassure the possibility of life-shaping worship. And most of all, mentors will guide anxious and fearful servants to resolve the questions and confront the risks of being Christian in an unfair and violent world prejudiced against Christian faith. I want to end my remarks and leave a few moments for some questions from the large group before our refreshments by saying a word about the Christological center that lies at the heart of every growing church. It lies at the heart of the synergy of church growth. As I said earlier, the best words to describe the synergy for authentic church growth are the words deeper, further. This is not possible, however, until the church is clear into what exactly is the Christian church going deeper and further. The genius of the Chalcedon Confession in the year 451 of the Christian era is that it captures the original attitude of the earliest church. The church is not going deeper into theology, and it is not going further into philanthropy. It is going deeper into Christ and further with Christ. The heart of the gospel is Jesus Christ, fully human and fully divine, infinite paradox, yet crucial for abundant and eternal life. Every growing church, whether they're very conservative and fundamentalist, whether they're extraordinarily liberal, and there are both, but every growing church has this Christological center, regardless of brand name, ideological stance, or theological perspective. fundamentalist or mainstream, liberal or conservative, denominational or independent, liturgical, confessional, evangelical, charismatic, holiness, or social activist, none of it matters to the potential of church growth. Yet all must have a Christological center. The discipling process rotates around this center. This center is the depth and purpose of the discipling process. Take away the center and the church will sidetrack into a fellowship club, educational institutions, or social service agencies with overhead costs that will make them non-competitive with other agencies. The most recent trend in church planting and multi-site worship and in worship design is called the incarnational church. This may sound redundant. Are not all churches by their very nature incarnational? Certainly not. The more churches sidetrack into mere fellowship gatherings, mere heritage societies, and mere philanthropic agencies, the less they speak of Christ. Yet the recovery of incarnational church from its ancient beginnings is more than just a discipling process. It is the purposefulness with which they help people experience the real presence, the immediacy, or the touch, voice, scent, taste, and breath of Jesus the Christ. These are churches that go beyond dogma to experience and beyond conversion to participation. Their object is to literally, not just metaphorically or figuratively, be in companionship with Christ. The tactics for sensory surround worship, or for small group accountability, or for action reflection mission, are all simply vehicles to achieve this experiential intimacy, this merging of oneself and the higher truth and mystery that is Christ. And what of the post-secular public out there? Are they attracted to the incarnational church? Are very busy, dual career, highly skeptical, rarely guilty, incredibly selfish, spiritual seekers ready to experiment with the incarnational church and invest huge amounts of time and energy in a discipling process? All across North America, the answer is increasingly yes. And that public will connect with the experience of Christ in 6 distinct ways. Number 1, broken people long for the Christ who heals. Number 2, lost people long for the Christ, the spiritual guide. Number 3, lonely people long for Christ, the perfect human and the perfect friend. Number 4, victimized people long for Christ, the vindicator. Number 5, anxious people long for Christ, the promise keeper and the giver of hope. And number 6, addicted people long for Christ, the new being, the apocalyptic one, who can rescue me from my world of death. 6 kinds of seeking public, 6 kinds of experience of Christ. Insofar as your church deploys mentors who can help seekers find one of those experiences of Christ, your church grows. And insofar as your church only has programs or great music or adequate parking and neglects the growth and deployment of mentors who will guide people in the discipling process, your church dies. The real question about the future of authentic church growth in North America is not whether the public will come. It is whether the established church can lead. Thank you for hearing me out in my first rant about the church.